Okay, let's go ahead and start the first of our evening classes. We'll be talking in the evening classes about different ways that people propose we should be doing apologetics. And we'll be doing that, like we mentioned earlier, from this book, 5 Views on Apologetics. We'll be reading all of them except for John Frame, because his view is the view that I'll be presenting in class. So you will not be required to read that material, just because the book is already pretty long. I'm sure you noticed, just by reading this first chapter, that the different ways of doing apologetics are very different. They are very different. Just initially, what did you notice any major differences between the way William Lane Craig begins his presentation of apologetics and what we started talking about in this class?
He was focusing on the Spirit, the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And for John Frame, he agreed, yes,
Mm-hmm.
but he believed that he missed out one of the essential parts, which is the word along with the Spirit.
Yes.
So that is what I believe.
That's a fantastic observation. That is very true. As far as as one of the major differences between the positions is what role this book plays in our apologetics. And I think that Frame did a very good job of responding to William Lane Craig. I'm sure you noticed that Craig is much more philosophical in his discussions. Did you think he was hard to read?
Yes.
Yeah, William Lane Craig is hard to read.
Things that he could have said in simpler terms. He used all these big words to just say what he was going to say.
Yeah.
And it was kind of confusing, but not too hard to follow.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a couple things. First of all, he mentions early on that he did receive his master's and his doctrine in philosophy, which I think really, I'm sure that he's writing, the way he thinks and the way he normally speaks with his colleagues is on a very high philosophical level. And I think we see that coming out in this book. But I think we also kind of see him showing, I know what I'm talking about, a little bit too. So with that being said, I kind of just wanted to talk about, there's a big difference between the way he's arguing and the way that we're arguing in class. I kind of want to do an overview of the different methods really quickly, or kind of like the background of the different methods so we can have an orientation for what we're doing in the evening classes. If you're taking notes right now, on your final exam study guide, question 4, based on the survey of the 5 apologetic methods given in class, define and defend your preferred method. So if you were answering question 4, these evening classes especially will be helpful. Now you are more than welcome to disagree with me about what the best method is. I'd love to have a conversation with you about that. If in the course of this class you're like, you know what, one of these guys was really convincing to me, and I think that's how apologetics should be done, that'll make for a really healthy and good conversation. So don't feel like you have to agree with me. But just for an overview, there's 5 methods that are presented in this book. The first method is the classical method, and that's with William Lane Craig. That's what we learned about tonight. That's what we read about coming to class. The second method is the evidential method. The third method is the cumulative case method. Then we have the presuppositional method, which is the method that we're learning in this class during the morning sessions. And that's with John Frame, is the person in this book. He also wrote this Doctrine of the Knowledge of God book that I mentioned earlier. And he is the one who gave us our definition we're using for the class also, is John Frame. And then the last method is the Reformed epistemology method with Kelly James Clark. So these are the 5 methods we'll be discussing.
Kelly's a woman.
Kelly is a man. I think that's why he put all 3 names, maybe, because of the James, just to make sure you knew. But yeah, I had to look that up. I was like, I don't know. No, but Kelly's a man. Okay, so just to kind of give you some ideas of how these relate to each other, these first three are very similar to each other. The classical, the evidential, and the cumulative case are very similar. In fact, I think when we read them, a lot of our discussion is going to be how are they even different? Because they use the same kind of arguments even. They're going to be using a deductive argument for God's existence. So they're going to be stating evidences for God's existence and concluding that God exists. For the presuppositional method, they use what is called the transcendental argument. And we're going to get into what this looks like later on. Transcendental, transcendental argument for God's existence. And the Reformed epistemology method does not use arguments. They use no arguments. And this is the most interesting of the five, I think. It's kind of hard to nail down. And even as you read Kelly James Clark, it's kind of hard to understand exactly what he's saying because it's so abstract. It's very postmodern. So what it's going to look like for this first group here, they're going to say X, therefore God exists. So they're going to say the universe displays design, therefore God exists. It must have a designer. Arguments like that we'll be getting to as we continue. The presuppositional method is going to say God exists because the contrary is impossible. If God did not exist, you could not explain any part of reality. You could not know anything. You could not know right from wrong. You could not know anything at all. And that is the transcendental argument, which, again, we're covering that more during our day classes. And then this last one, Reformed epistemology, if you had to guess, what would you say that they do? They just say, God exists. God exists. They don't have an argument. They just say, God exists. A couple more things about these broad groups, then we'll get into our discussion. This group is going to be arguing that God most likely exists. So they're going to be arguing that based upon the evidence, it is more likely that God exists than he doesn't. In fact, the cumulative case method with Paul Feinberg, when we get to that, he has an illustration that I think is really, really revealing in this book. So he says, if we consider the evidences for God's existence to be like a bucket with holes in it, okay? Then we put two buckets on top of each other, then 3, then 4, then 5, all the way up to 10. Those buckets are going to hold water. So all of the arguments aren't totally convincing that God exists, but if you put them all together, it's more likely that God exists than he doesn't. That's what those guys are arguing for. And there's a little bit of nuance in that, so I want to be very fair to the views. There is nuance within the different views of God most likely exists, and we'll get into that later. This is just for generalizations. The presuppositional method says the God of the Bible must exist. And I'm differentiating there between God most likely exists, which is these methods, God, and the God of the Bible must exist. So this method is arguing for specifically the Christian God of the Bible, which is very important for understanding the view. In the Reformed epistemology, God exists. And I think they would nuance it with the God of the Bible. At least, I think Kelly James Clark tends in his writing to say the God of the Bible. I'm not sure he actually says that, though. So I'm excited to talk about that with you guys. Lastly, these methods right here start with man and they reason their way to God. So they start with what we see around us. They start with humans and then work up to God. Is this a lot for this late at night? No? Okay, good. We're all trying. Oh, I said, is this a lot for this late at night? No. Okay, good. It's very general, but it's going to get more specific as we go. The presuppositional method is going to start with God and then explain everything else. So this is one of the biggest differences between these two, is where the starting point is. Do you start with God or do you start with us? Which, and you'll learn this in your church history if you haven't taken yet, that was the conversation that took place in the Enlightenment. The question is, do we start with the assumption of God and then work our way down to us, or do we start with us and work our way to God? In Reformed epistemology, God exists. And I think that's going to be more clear when we discuss the method. Okay, with that being said, I'll give you time to finish writing that down. Any questions at all about that? Okay. So the big thing to come away from this is these three are very similar. These two are different. I will say the presuppositional and the Reformed epistemology are somewhat similar to each other, but they differ in some pretty significant ways. These guys, right? If you were one of these guys, though, you would probably say that that these two are basically the same thing. I disagree with that, but I've seen many conversations, many videos, read a few. In this book, that's actually one of the critiques of William Lane Craig, I think, and Gary Habermas for the Reformed epistemology, is that it's the same thing as presuppositionalism. It's not. It's not. It's very different. Okay, so let's go ahead and we will discuss the classical apologetic method.